So, I remember seeing both G.I. Joe films when I was in high school and when I was in college. And honestly, looking at them like, yeah man, they're okay, whatever. I never grew up with G.I. Joe, and what things I saw of G.I. Joe were either parodies from Robot Chicken or from the Venture Brothers.
Great job, Trouser Snake.
It's fumbles. It was always fumbles.
Never forget fumbles. But what I can tell you was that the only thing that I really remember from those movies is what my high school best friend Brad called that ninja shit, man. And what he was referring to was the fight scenes between the black ninja and the white ninja throughout the films. Those ninjas were called Snake Eyes and Storm Shadow. And between those two movies, their relationship was the most fleshed out. It might be because the fact that those were two of only 4 actors to come back from the first film. Everyone else from the first film were either killed off or were recast or just never brought up in the film. It's almost like there was an outside problem that caused all this. But oh well, I guess we'll never know. But if I'm being honest with you, their conflict seemed like it had the most stakes. I remember walking out of the theater after G.I. Joe Retaliation, and my then girlfriend asked me what I thought about it. And I remembered Brad's words from 4 years ago, and I just said, it was fine. I wish they focused more on that ninja shit though. And 8 years later, my prayers were answered as Paramount released Snake Eyes, a G.I. Joe origin story to kick off their own G.I. Joe film universe, because, yeah, why not? It performed poorly in the box office, so 4 weeks after its release, you could buy it on digital. And I did, and I watched it, and it's okay. It's a dumb martial arts action film. I don't know what people were expecting, really. Do not get me wrong, it's really flawed in some parts, but it's not this train wreck or hot garbage some people are pointing it out to be. It's a pretty good and compelling story that forgets it's a G.I. Joe film until the very end. That's where it kind of, falls right on its face.
Freedom!
But I have been seeing reviews and videos calling it a bad film or how it was just this disaster. To me, the definition of good and bad is subjective, and if I'm being honest, I was not expecting much from this film besides, yo man, check out this cool ninja shit. And there do be a bunch of that cool ninja shit. But there were 2 things that made G.I. Joe fans extremely angry when the first trailer of Snake Eyes came out. Which, 1, Snake Eyes talked, which that makes kind of sense because the character never really talked in comic books or media. But if I could make a counter argument though, this is an origin story, and that is setting up the relationship of Snake Eyes with G.I. Joe the Secret Unit and with his rival Storm Shadow, as well as his complex relationship with the Ninja Clan. But what was the second one? Oh, he's played by an Asian actor. But hold on, Snake Eyes is white, right? It's kind of a hyperbolic complaint for a character who only shows his face a few times. So does changing his race matter? Yeah, I think it does a little bit. But I'm not in the camp that, no, Snake Eyes should be a white guy! Because technically all of his bios have his name and origins redacted, so he could be anyone. I mean, he could even be a woman. Just kidding. That's why G.I. Joe made Jinx. I didn't really know that, I just read it off the Wikipedia page for G.I. Joe Retaliation. So they never really show Snake Eyes' face for the most part, and when they do, most of the time it's silhouetted. But there was one time where they showed his full face, which was scarred and disfigured, and he had a blondish hair and blue eyes. And in the G.I. Joe films they showed him without a mask, but he was a child. So when it comes down to it, Snake Eyes being played by Henry Golding doesn't really matter. But I also think Snake Eyes being Asian allows us to talk and subvert a stereotype and problem that Hollywood is still very guilty of. It's the white outsider trope and Hollywood's use of orientalism. Before I go into the white outsider or chosen one trope, we need to talk about something that usually goes hand in hand when talking about Asians in the media. We need to talk about orientalism. Since the publication of Edward Said's Orientalism in 1978, Orientalism is a term that refers to a general patronizing Western attitude towards Middle Eastern, Asian, and North African societies. In Said's analysis, the West essentializes these societies as static and undeveloped, thereby fabricating a view of Oriental culture that can be studied, depicted, and reproduced in the service of imperial power. Implicit in this fabrication, writes Said, is the idea that Western society is developed, rational, flexible, and superior. Orientalism in the modern lens is how we view Eastern cultures to be exotic and mystical. I talked about this kind of idea a little bit in my Unpacking the Lotus Blossom and Yellow Fever video. Link for it is at the top. But Western culture has always written about the Far East through the lens of Orientalism. You have racist characters like the character of Fu Manchu and the Siamese cats in Lady and the Tramp, to the subtle yellow peril and fear of the East taking over in the cyberpunk genre, the romanticism and exoticism of Japan in the Memoirs of a Geisha, to just the mystical new world unknown to the new characters in the World of Warcraft's expansion pack, The Mist of Pandaria. Orientalism plays a big part in how Hollywood movie tropes of the stranger in a strange land trope works. Some examples of the trope are comic book characters such as Iron Fist, Matt Damon's character in The Great Wall, and Tom Cruise in The Last Samurai, as well as Michael Aguinaldo in The Forbidden Kingdom. Each of these characters go to Asia that is different to them. For most of these characters, they are lost in their normal life, but come to Asia, this wonderful and strange land that they don't understand their culture at first, sometimes might even find it barbaric. But they learn from the people of that land, whether it be martial arts or philosophy, and realize that there's a conflict in that land that they now call home, and they're saving it or dying for it. Now, I want to be very clear that the stranger in the strange land trope when it comes to Asians in media isn't always coming from a state of racism, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't come from a state of ignorance on how the West views the East. Now, what can Snake Eyes teach us about subverting the white savior trope when it comes to Asians in media? It makes him Asian, but he's still an outsider. There's been a recent conversation about this kind of stuff. It started around 2017 when Netflix was about to release Iron Fist, where some of the Asian American community and Asian comic book fans made the argument that maybe Iron Fist should be Asian. Now, there was of course discourse in this matter because Danny Rand is portrayed as being a blonde-haired, blue-eyed American boy. Nancy Wang Young is a sociologist and the author of Real Inequality Hollywood Actors and Racism, a book about the vast racial disparity in pop culture. She said this about Iron Fist in an article from Inverse. I think the source material is Orientalist. Anything that's set in Asia or with Asian culture is treated as an object rather than a subject. Martial arts and yoga, it's a consumption item rather than an actual culture to be respected. But the underlying drive to reimagine Iron Fist as an Asian America was never just about seeing more Asian Americans on screen. It was about reclaiming the character that used a culture as an aesthetic, which is something I didn't think about in 2017. I was and I still am a fan of Iron Fist, but I do think that there is an argument that making Iron Fist and Snake Eyes Asian doesn't ruin the integrity of what that character is about, because a recent movie called Batman Soul of the Dragon, because it portrays Richard Dragon, who in the DC comics is written and drawn as a red-headed white dude. That is basically just the Iron Fist of the DC universe. In the movie, he looks like Bruce Lee and is voiced by Asian American actor Mark Dacascos. The core of Richard Dragon was still there. He was still an outsider, he still came into learning martial arts, and he still becomes the chosen one by the end. As well as the Amazon Prime show Invincible subtly turning Mark Grayson Asian and having him voiced by Steven Yeun and his mother voiced by Sandra Oh. His race doesn't change the core of his character. Henry Golding, who played Snake Eyes, said this about his casting. It starts from the conception, creating stories and characters anybody can play. Is it so important that your character has to be a particular race? If it's the character's actions that drive the story, then anyone can play it. Anyone should play it. If you're not serving justice to the page, then what's the point? Golding also makes an argument that he understands the core of Snake Eyes because in his own life, he has been an outsider. He's either too Asian for some people and not Asian enough for others. So when you watch the film, him being Asian doesn't change anything. It doesn't affect the essence of the character. The narrative around being the other can apply to any race. Now, again, the counter argument is that he was always written as a white person. And you're right, but this person who wrote Snake Eyes and a lot of those little mini paragraphs is Japanese-American comic book writer Larry Hama. When talking about Hama and working with the team to make Snake Eyes, Henry Golding had this to say. Hama gave us license to create with him the backstory that he always wanted to tell. People are like, that's not history, he's white. Well, maybe Larry had to do that. Larry had to make it such an obvious story. Hama was involved in creating the story for the Snake Eyes film and was on set being shown everything. In 2021, Larry Hama had this to say about Henry Golding being cast and Snake Eyes being Asian. Some people are saying that casting Golding fixes the character of Snake Eyes, but I disagree. I had wanted to keep him ambiguous until Hasbro introduced Storm Shadow as the only Asian character and made him a bad guy. I decided to fix that by delving into his background and gradually turning him into a good guy. This is why Snake Eyes is a white guy. But later on in a most recent interview, he says this: "You have to understand that almost all of G.I. Joe has always been retconned. I have been a member of the Screen Actors Guild since 1976, and the only part that I was offered for were bad guys. Bad guys, thugs, waiters, medical examiners. You can run the entire gamut of all the horrible roles. With the family TV, my grandmother would come running into the other room and start shouting that there's an Asian person in TV, but it was so rare. We never saw any sort of representation, so for me to be making these tentpole movies with Asians in the lead is something that I never thought I'd see in my lifetime." He also said this experience that hit home with him about Snake Eyes. "I was doing a panel and this Asian kid at the back of the auditorium raised his hand to ask a question and said, 'So tell me, Mr. Hama, why is the most badass ninja in the entire world some white guy?' I was floored. I didn't know how to answer him. I thought, there seemed to be almost no way to fix that within the comic context." And even before the Snake Eyes Asian controversy, Hama was very aware of low-key orientalism and racism against Asian people in the G.I. Joe brand when they introduced Storm Shadow, who at the time was the only Asian character, and he was the bad guy. Hama said this about that: "When Hasbro introduced Storm Shadow, I think in the second or third year, he was the only Asian character in the entire universe, and he was a bad guy. So I deliberately decided to make him over into a good guy over the course of the next 6 months to a year." Hama understood why they did this casting because Hama is Asian. He tries his best in the 80s to show that sort of subtle Asian representation. So when people have this anger towards the casting of Henry Golding, it sounds very trivial. Now, I think Snake Eyes handles its Asian aspects of the film well for the most part, and we'll get into those, but that is what usually happens when we appropriate a culture for a narrative. Before I go into this, cultural appropriation isn't a negative or positive term whatsoever. The term itself is defined as the adaptation of elements of one culture by another. So yes, you can have some problematic things that happen using cultural appropriation, but it's not always bad to appropriate a culture if you're doing it with respect. Snake Eyes uses Japanese culture as its backdrop, but for the most part, the movie is influenced by Yakuza films, samurai films, and maybe even some Chinese wuxia films, which all work but don't work at the same time. With the Yakuza influence, it's very cool aesthetic for the film and how they're dressed. When it comes to the tropes in Yakuza films, it's like a revenge film, as well as kind of feeling like a samurai film, a Ronin without a master kind of thing. He's just trying to find the purpose of his life. The fight choreography is very impressive as well, and is very Japanese because the stunts are coordinated by Kenji Tanigaki, who is well known for doing stunt work for the live-action Rurouni Kenshin films. And the fight scenes when they're involving swords are very fluid. You can tell that there is care taken with showing off the sword work. One thing you see is when Andrew Koji, Storm Shadow, is handling two blades is a reference to the ancient Japanese swordsman Musashi, as well as the filming a good chunk of the movie in Japan, like in Kishiwada Castle and Engyo-jo. Something that I find very impressive, the characters that are Japanese are played by Asian actors, but they're also of Japanese heritage. I brought this up a little bit in my Raya the Last Dragon that I was really excited for the movie, but it was kind of sad that a lot of the characters were actually from East Asia, even though this was a Southeast Asian story. In here you have Japanese actors like Andrew Koji, who you might remember from Warrior, Haruka Abe, Ira Ashida, and Takahara Hira. I would just like to point out how much I enjoyed Koji's performance as Storm Shadow because he brings a depth to the character that wasn't seen from the character in the first two movies when he was introduced. Storm Shadow comes off as this man of honor, and if he was written worse, it'd just be really skin deep. but they make him a compelling character that he believes that he loves his ninja clan, but he thinks we should modernize it. But the one thing that digs deep into the roots and the feeling of Japanese culture is the music. In dramatic fight scenes that are filled with tension, there's a subtle playing of the Japanese taiko drum. There are a lot of positive things that can be found when talking about representations of Asians in the media, but also at the same time, this film falls very short. So the beginning of this film works because it feels grounded, but once you reach the end of the second act, the shift from gritty revenge takes on the Asian mysticism route, making characters say fortune cookie catchphrases that come off just extremely cringy. They try to play it off like, oh, look at how dumb it is these phrases are doing, but they just keep doing it. Again, this kind of stuff isn't bad when handled correctly, but it felt very forced. It seems incredibly out of place because there was no build up to it, so it brings the movie downward. Another thing that becomes very jarring is the fact that at the beginning you see the Yakuza are shipping guns and fish, and also getting guns from Cobra, but none of them are using guns at all for the most part. They use the occasional submachine gun in one big scene. Everyone is just using samurai swords. Again, this isn't a bad thing, but they show that guns are more effective at the end when Scarlet and the Baroness mow down a bunch of swordsmen. This is aesthetically cool looking because when you think of Yakuza and ninjas, they're using swords. But this is again in modern times, and this franchise is based on military weapons and shooting stuff. It just becomes particularly jarring. As well as the end credits showing off neon kanji and kabuki dancers, they weren't really part of the film, and is just shown as an aesthetic choice is like, yeah, that's cool, but it's like a little weird at the same time. But in the end, I don't think Snake Eyes is a hot mess. I just think it tries to juggle a lot and just fails at most of it. But what they do well, they do it very well. I think Snake Eyes is interesting to write a think piece about because it is one of the recent films with Asian leads that came out this year, from things like the CW's Kung Fu, Paper Tigers, Raya the Last Dragon, and Shang-Chi that just recently came out. There seems to be a surge in media centered around Asian people, so it's good to talk about how it helps push representation of Asians in the media and what we can do better to do so. Hey guys, thanks for watching. This video took a little bit longer. Sorry it takes me ages to make stuff, but I would prefer to make videos that I like instead of feeling obligated about. Like and share it if you enjoyed it, and if you want to support me, you can do that on Patreon, and follow me on Twitter for all my bad hot takes. The links are down below. As always, you are cared for, and whatever you're going through, you've got this, cowboy.